So one of my first jobs is to try and restore trust in government.
And that starts with being honest with people.
Well, let's take a look at how that's going.
The starting salary of a nurse would be £31,000.
It's just a barefaced lie, which the chairman of the Conservative Party was happy to hop over to the next channel to repeat.
The starting salary of a nurse would hit about £31,000.
The figure he's talking about includes extra earnings such as overtime and unsocial hours pay. Basic pay for a newly qualified nurse this year would be about £27,000. The Health Secretary himself has admitted it.
Well, I thought you were going to ask me about nurses, because the first strike we're going to have on is nurses. A nursing starting salary is 25.5, and we're taking it up to 27.
The starting salary of a nurse would hit about £31,000.
When members of the government have to resort to deliberately misleading the public, you know they've lost the argument. And thanks to the Conservative government scrapping the nurses' bursary, which had previously reimbursed their tuition fees, they now qualify tens of thousands of pounds in debt.
We've accepted in full the recommendations of independent bodies who make the recommendations to the government about pay settlements in the public sector. But what I'm not going to do is ask ordinary families up and down the country to pay an extra £1,000 a year to meet the pay demands of the union bosses. That wouldn't be right, and it wouldn't be fair.
It's just more lies, and even worse, the Prime Minister has been sending out members of his government to repeat it.
If you accept all the inflation level pay rises, that's about £28 billion. It costs every household just short of £1,000.
We've also got to balance that with what is fair for your viewers. And if everyone in the public sector were to receive a pay rise in line with inflation, that would cost an extra £28 billion, an extra £1,000 per household.
There are 28 million households in the UK, and the Prime Minister is telling the public a real terms pay rise for public sector workers will cost every one of them an extra £1,000 a year. It's completely untrue. The Prime Minister knows it, and so do the government ministers shamelessly repeating it. It assumes all 28 million UK households would make exactly the same contribution in tax, but some households don't pay income tax, and the amount of tax paid varies from household to household, with the best off paying more. And any pay rise for public sector workers will itself be taxable, and that tax is included within the 28 billion, which goes straight back to the government. So with all that in mind, listen to this again.
What I'm not going to do is ask ordinary families up and down the country to pay an extra £1,000 a year.
It costs every household just short of £1,000.
An extra £1,000 per household.
It's absolutely shameful, and even worse when completely unchallenged. Now take a look at this. We've secured new trade deals with over 70 countries since 2016. That's over £800 billion worth of new global trade, the Conservative Party has triumphantly tweeted. That tweet was shared by a number of members of the government, but most of these deals were simply rolled over from existing EU agreements following Brexit. The figure refers to the total value of trade between the UK and countries it has agreed trade deals with, not the value that they add. So saying these trade deals are worth over £800 billion in new global trade is just complete bollocks. Yes, we've done some new trade deals, for instance with Australia, and on that let's listen to former Environment Secretary George Eustace addressing the House of Commons on November 14th.
I was in the Cabinet in 2021, and I was in this Cabinet subcommittee that argued over the Australian trade deal. For yes, there were deep arguments and differences over how we should approach this. But since I now enjoy the freedom of the backbenches, I no longer have to put such a positive gloss on what was agreed. The first step is to recognise that the Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK. The truth of the matter is that the UK gave away far too much for far too little in return.
And then there's the trade deal with New Zealand.
British farmers have reacted with shock to the terms of a new free trade deal with New Zealand.
The deal will see Kiwi meat imported without tariffs, and farmers in the UK say they get nothing in return.
A world away from rejoicing Kiwi farmers, their welly-wearing counterparts feel as though they are the sacrificial lambs of the free trade deal.
We're not competing on a level playing field. It's us surrendering to you, New Zealanders, and giving you a great deal, and we're getting nothing out of it.
The impact on Britain's economy is expected to be negligible.
And the lies keep coming.
Just remember one thing, Mr. Speaker. We had the fastest vaccine rollout in the world. We had that because of our freedoms after leaving the European Union.
It's just complete bollocks and long since debunked. But again, the Prime Minister was happy to send out his Levelling Up secretary to repeat it.
We wouldn't have had the vaccine rollout that was so successful if we'd been within the European Union.
Under European law, the UK was permitted to act independently to approve the vaccine in an emergency, and the Prime Minister knows it. Britain was still bound by EMA rules when the COVID vaccination programme began. Don't just take my word for it, listen to the head of the MHRA, June Rain.
We appear to be getting authorisation for this vaccine ahead of our friends in Europe. I was just wondering, does the fact that the UK is no longer part of the EU, did that make any difference to the speed with which you were able to complete your authorisation?
We have been able to authorise the supply of this vaccine using provisions under European law which exist until the 1st of January.
EU legislation enacted into British law already allowed countries to temporarily authorise vaccines without waiting for approval from the EMA. In fact, the UK government always made it clear that it could authorise vaccines unilaterally under European law before we left the EU.